FPS is dead. Call of Duty Modern Warfare's 2019 reboot was enormously successful, selling a boatload of copies and generating $600 million only 3 days after launch, according to Tom Henderson of Viral Junkie. Its sequels have also sold quite well. I know what you're thinking. If that's the case, then why would someone say FPS is dead? Let me explain. Sales of that volume certainly indicate that the market's healthy, but is success in the market the same as actually succeeding in making a good game? There are so many ways to swindle cash out of people without truly pleasing them, but instead by psychologically manipulating them. The foremost example of this is the gacha genre, usually on mobile platforms. They're designed to be playable for free, up to a threshold beyond which progress slows to a crawl, requiring the player to purchase in-game items with real-world money in order to proceed. By taking advantage of the sunken costs mentality, the publishers profit. After all, it would feel pretty wasteful to invest 50 hours into a game, only to quit playing it after the progress starts to slow down, so what's the harm in spending a few bucks? Only, beyond that threshold, all progress is monetized, and since the game is highly addictive but not necessarily highly satisfying, it encourages impulsive and continuous purchases, just like an eternally hungry person would do in a mall's food court. I've seen people I know pour hundreds of dollars into these games, even going into credit card debt just to keep playing them. That is exactly what the publishers intend. On top of the fact that these games use gambling mechanics, which themselves are psychologically manipulative, there's something morally dubious about this business practice. Gacha-style mechanics which promote addictive behaviors are bleeding into the PC and console market. Why is this happening? I think it's largely the result of the failure of the console and PC market to catch up with the mobile market in terms of market share and profits. Consider this. Mobile gaming has quickly overtaken console and PC gaming in that category. TechTree reports that mobile games claim 58.8% of the digital games market as of 2019. And I figure that as smartphones become more popular and gamers of previous decades grow up and have less time to spend at home, that percentage share is only going to increase. This really matters because it effectively means the end of games is a packaged, complete product that treats players as ends in and of themselves. Games of the past were designed to be satisfying and fun, fully featured experiences that respected their players and which are more akin to art than a cynical market cash grab designed to rake in revenue. I'm talking about classic games like Morrowind, Doom, the Halo games, classic Fallout, and so on. Development cycles for games were a lot shorter, and profit came directly from game sales, so the developers had to get it right on launch, or it was game over. However, in recent years, new ways to profit from games were discovered, so modern games are becoming increasingly indistinguishable as publishers switch over to the live service model. Expansions have atrophied to mere downloadable content, which can be anything from a weapon reskin to new maps, allowing publishers to charge a player multiple times throughout the year for increasingly less content. Call of Duty Advanced Warfare was the first game in the COD franchise to include transactions that outright gave in-game advantages which were unavailable to those who didn't pay. Server browsers, which gave players the ability to choose what kind of matches they play and with what kind of players, have now been almost universally replaced with black box matchmaking systems that inscrutably decide for you, allowing the publisher to monopolize the game experience to increase engagement at the cost of enjoyment. Content is being recycled to artificially extend gameplay time, which is the essence of Ubisoft's checklist collectathon game design, and which is now becoming commonplace in other games. Modern games have also appropriated addictive progression systems that at one point were exclusive to MMORPGs, such as daily login bonuses and progression trees like battle passes. Mod support, which at one point was a common feature of PC games, has now been deliberately excised in order to create a publisher monopoly on content and profit, or in the most forgiving cases has become just a selling point for a few specific franchises like The Elder Scrolls, which nonetheless the developers have tried at various points to cash in on in various ways. Games are being released with less and less content, and today it's almost expected that new releases are simply minimum viable live service products like Marvel's Avengers or Anthem to be finished at a later date, if at all, meaning we no longer get the feature-complete packages of the past. Today, we live in the age of the perpetual beta test. Live service games have made gamers totally dependent on the whims of the publisher to play their titles, removing any kind of choice, ownership, or modding capability, and also providing a convenient excuse to cut content from the game and to provide it later as free updates, as we saw in Battlefield 5 and Black Ops Cold War, both of which were launched with an austere serving of content. Live services also allow publishers to shut down their games' online services so that previous titles no longer compete with future titles, and thus no longer burden the company financially once they fail to produce profit. The consequence is that you just can't play old games anymore. Everyone's favorite monetization feature, microtransactions, have reached PC and console as well, and are not optional, but rather expected as far as publishers are concerned. The industry today clearly could not be further from its roots. If we were to put our fingers to the pulse of FPS, it's still physically strong, but its soul is gone. What we see now is a corporate husk that moves not out of passion and virtue, but instead out of necessity. Unlike figures such as John Carmack and the rest of the id team, whose passions blossomed into the creation of Doom, developers today are completely alienated. They're just doing their jobs and following orders. They don't love what they do anymore, and as proof of this, there's a lot of attrition out of large game studios. If you've ever wondered why Cyberpunk 2077 was such a disaster, go look at the credits for The Witcher 3 and compare the developers there to those in Cyberpunk's credits. So many have left out of frustration with corporate burnout and mandatory crunch, including the guy majorly responsible for the development of the Red Engine that powers both games. CD Projekt Red has now even decided to drop the Red Engine entirely. So many talented developers have left DICE Sweden, in case you've ever wondered why the modern Battlefield games were such disasters. Infinity Ward contains only a fraction of its original employees, as many of the most influential ones left to develop Titanfall and Apex Legends, and the same goes for Treyarch and virtually any major studio you can think of whose employees have gone on to work in other studios or to drop out of game development entirely. Ultimately, I'd say that the fundamental cause not only of developer attrition, but also the rise of anti-consumer practices is the model of publicly traded corporations, and moreover, the predominance of the profit motive in society. While this doesn't explain everything, like Bethesda's paid mods fiasco in 2017, since that was before its Microsoft acquisition privately traded, the vast majority of companies ruining our favorite games with invasive and manipulative monetization are publicly traded. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm aware that CEOs of publicly traded companies can be sued if they make a decision that does not aim to maximize profits. So herein lies the problem. If the company isn't growing or trying to grow, then it's dying. So naturally, every successive game must be more profitable. It must contain more monetization, and the studio must push its developers harder to deliver, meaning mandatory crunch. When the proverbial well of fair monetization runs dry, things have to start getting dirty, because the corporation must continue to deliver dividends to shareholders, and it must continue trying to grow, even if that's to the detriment of the quality of the games. It's the law. But it's not only the law. Capitalism as a system depends on asymptotic growth to avoid collapse. And if that's apparent anywhere, it's apparent in industries commanded by these publicly traded companies. Profits have to keep rising, or the house of cards will come crashing down. Understanding that really puts things into perspective. After all, Bobby Kotick wasn't evil, he was just playing to the meta. Now that he's leaving Activision, since the company is being acquired by Microsoft, many people have speculated that this will bring much needed improvement to the company. Kotick is often blamed for Activision's exploitation of consumers. However, I know for a fact that his departure will change nothing. The problem was never Kotick. The problem is capitalism, and Kotick was just playing by its rules and its incentives. Activision will continue to manipulate and underdeliver. This is the status quo for AAA studios now, and it's not going away. So, I want to make something clear. Pay-to-win microtransactions, live services, minimum viable releases, and so on are bad enough. I hate seeing them and want all of that gone, but if that were only it, I could stomach it and still play the games. I wouldn't be happy, but FPS would be far from dead to me. In fact, if these were our worst gripes, things have actually kind of improved in the last few years. After a combination of lawsuits in Europe and calls in the United States to classify loot boxes as gambling, combined with general consumer backlash, loot drops were removed from Modern Warfare 2019 and replaced with a reasonably fair battle pass. PUBG and Apex Legends have similar battle passes. Most microtransactions in games today are cosmetic only and barely affect gameplay, and you can play the whole thing without spending an additional penny. Really, it's none of that which matters in the end. We're seeing something new and unprecedented: engagement optimization. If you've ever wondered why you can't seem to do well anymore in Call of Duty, why your matches are so hard, why your bullets don't register, or why you die from an enemy shooting the air next to you in the kill cam, The problem is most likely engagement optimization. This is the reason why modern games are more addictive but less fun. So what is engagement? Brody et al. 2011 defines engagement as a psychological state that occurs by virtue of interactive, co-creative consumer experiences with a focal agent or object, which the paper I'm about to reference more concisely defines as gameplay. I'll let this 2018 paper by Huang et al. Explain exactly what engagement optimization is and how it affects gameplay. In this paper, he proposes that player engagement can be divided into 3 stages: low, medium, and high engagement, that players transition between the stages over time, and that during each stage of engagement, players need different match outcomes to stay engaged. At the start of the paper, he discusses why engagement optimization is so important and why it's beneficial to publishers to increase engagement. In many of those sectors, the music and movie industry, consumers make one-time purchases of products, and the objective of the producers is typically to maximize the one-time sales revenue. In the video game industry, on the other hand, in addition to consumers' initial purchases, their post-purchase gameplay activities are very important for video game companies' revenue. Player engagement and continuous gameplay are strongly correlated with a video game's financial success. This is because players' gameplay frequency and volume can positively contribute to the game revenue under almost all types of revenue models used by video games. For games with in-game purchase features, the more rounds a player plays, the more she is likely to spend on in-game purchases, leading to a higher game revenue. For games with in-game display ads, the more a player plays, the more ads she will be exposed to, leading to a higher click-through number and thus a higher game revenue. For games that do not have either in-game purchase or in-game advertising features, a higher gameplay frequency or volume is still likely to positively contribute to game revenue because highly engaged players are more likely to upgrade to the premium or subsequent version of the game. In addition to the direct impact of players' engagement and gameplay and game revenue mentioned above, existing players' high gameplay frequency and volume can help attract new players through buzz, visibility, and network effects. In practice, video game companies use daily, weekly, monthly active users, i.e. the number of unique users on a day, in a week, or in a month, as key performance indicators of their video game products. Gameplay frequency and volume are closely related to these parsimonious performance measures, and that a higher gameplay frequency or volume typically corresponds to a higher daily, monthly, or weekly active users, and thus indicates a better game product performance. So clearly, higher engagement means more profit, more microtransaction purchases, and so on, making methods to optimize engagement attractive to publishers, investors, and shareholders. So to facilitate engagement, publishers have tasked developers with creating manipulative matchmaking systems based on consumer research to keep players logging in and playing, mainly by creating and reinforcing addictive behavior. Note that this doesn't mean necessarily making the game more enjoyable, because losing or being challenged in an unfair way can be addictive too, even if it is frustrating. As a rhetorical question to illustrate why do you think people manage to become addicted to gambling, even when they eventually lose all their winnings? It's because they're chasing the dragon, the hypothetical potential to win big in the future. Again, Huang is illustrative because, as it turns out, earning more score does not always increase engagement. First, somewhat surprisingly, we find that obtaining higher scores does not always keep the players engaged. The positive effect of the total score on the propensity of moving or staying in a higher engagement state exists only when the players are either in the low or the high engagement state. When players are in the medium engagement state, a higher total score can slightly reduce their propensity to move to a higher engagement state. Also, the magnitude of the positive effect of the total score is larger for players who are currently engaged than those who are in a low engagement state. So as Huang explains, for low engagement players, those are players who aren't playing the game often, earning a lot of score and having successful game outcomes tends to keep them coming back, taking them to the medium engagement stage. However, medium engagement players are not likely to become high engagement players if they are not challenged. Those players will actually play the game more frequently, passing into high engagement, if their matches are tougher and if you lose more frequently or gain less total score, kind of like how a gambler who wins $200 the first time he plays roulette can't pull him away even after a string of losses. The house already has its hooks sunk into him from the first winnings. Next, Huang explains how variation is also important for a medium engagement player. The standard deviation of the scores a player receives from different rounds she plays in a period also has differential effects on individuals' propensity of moving toward a higher engagement state. For players in the lower medium engagement state, higher variations in the gameplay outcome actually increase the propensity of moving to a higher engagement state. When a medium engagement player becomes a high engagement player, however, he starts to expect a higher impact on games as well as a higher total score. The effect of such variation is negative for individuals who are in the high engagement state. If we look at the joint effects of the total and the standard deviation of scores a player receives in a week on her engagement state evolution, we see that for players who are currently highly engaged, continuous reinforcement of their sense of effectiveness is important to keep them engaged, while the sense of being challenged discourages their continuous play. This may be because highly engaged players are eager to establish their records in the game and pay more attention to their performance and progress in achieving the game goal. Therefore, the feeling of effectiveness outweighs the need for challenges. Here's something really interesting. Most people are pretty familiar with the last couple of Call of Duty games and their engagement-optimized matchmaking, or SBMM. If you do really well in the game and play it frequently and get better at it, you'll get harder lobbies, and your KD, total score, and score per minute are going to start to plateau. As a lot of top pro players in Cold War had average KDs around 1.7, for instance, which seems to be the upper bound statistically, while some held KDs above 2, up to 3 and 4 in previous COD titles that didn't have engagement-optimized matchmaking. According to the sampled data in Huang et al., Call of Duty is actually matching high engagement skilled players incorrectly if it wants to maximize engagement. What should actually be done according to the data is to match skilled, high engagement players against lesser skilled, medium engagement players so they get a consistent feeling of effectiveness. Huang defines effectiveness as, paraphrased, the sense of potency or competence, efficacy, and control over the game environment. To put it shortly, high engagement players want to consistently succeed and to get high score lines and probably high KD ratios. Low engagement players want effectiveness too, but they also want to be challenged. For players who are in the low engagement state, both feelings of effectiveness and sense of being challenged can motivate their future participation. One potential explanation for this finding is that achieving high performance can re-arouse their interest in the game, Lin 2009. Besides, without hurting the total score, a moderate level of challenge can also motivate their future participation. Players who are in the medium engagement state enjoy being challenged, even at the expense of receiving a lower total score, indicating that those players care more about encountering challenges than mastering challenges. Gekas 1989. Again, I'm going to go back to using Call of Duty as an example. Have you noticed that your matches are easier after you've left the game for a long time and come back? The game's engagement optimization algorithm is attempting to motivate you by giving you high total scores, high score per minute, wins, and good match outcomes. Then your matches become more challenging until the game incorrectly throws you into high skill lobbies, sometimes ones you're destined to lose, in order to facilitate addictive win-loss cycles. If this paper's data is true, then Call of Duty's method of keeping players hooked might not actually be as effective as, again, giving high engagement players easy matches. But even if Call of Duty doesn't get it completely right, we know that a similar system is in the game, and that developers are constantly tweaking it in response to the data that they receive. These systems can and will progressively become more effective at manipulating players and keeping them in the game. Of course, engagement optimization is not a new thing itself in the game industry. It's just that we're starting to see it applied outside of its usual environment and in a more covert and sinister way that upsets fairness. It has crossed the line from being merely manipulative, sort of like how grocery stores will put impulse buy products next to the cash register, into being outright exploitative, like gambling. In the past, games would increase engagement by signposting progression systems or finding other ways to encourage players to come back, but without directly manipulating matches. In some ways, this form of engagement optimization could actually make the game more fun, since developers are finding ways to encourage players to take part in the gameplay. However, they have eventually realized that they can also encourage engagement by annoying the player. MMORPGs and later mobile games have implemented different kinds of engagement optimization for a long time. Remember stamina or energy bars from games like Farmville, allowing you to only play the game for a few minutes before you're forced to log out and check back later, or to purchase additional energy with real-world money? There's a lot of research proving that encouraging short but frequent gameplay sessions creates addiction, thus increasing long-term engagement. Now, different engagement optimization strategies are just reaching the FPS market, and research into them is just burgeoning. As more ways to manipulate and exploit players are discovered by scientists and psychologists, they will be implemented in a much more subtle and competent way. What I say now should be sort of alarming because it could seriously destroy multiplayer FPS games for the foreseeable future, if not games as a whole. Engagement optimization is being applied to matchmaking, and it's being used not to enhance the enjoyability of the game, but instead to create addictive win-loss patterns and to manipulate game lobbies to shield certain players and to generally create unfair matches. Other than Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, the biggest game that most likely started the arms race was Apex Legends, which implemented a skill-based matchmaking game, or SBMM, which cut player attrition down significantly by shielding low-skilled players from high-skilled ones. It wasn't the first game to implement such a system, but for the most part, multiplayer games have typically used connection or level-based matchmaking instead. Let's take a look back at Huang et al., where he quotes a programmer on the sort of matchmaking that has typically been used in games. Juice Van Dongen, a lead programmer and co-founder at Ronimo Games, noted in his blog that matchmaking is a highly important part of most multiplayer games. It's also a difficult topic to analyze and test before launch. Traditional matching algorithms that are used in most online video games do not utilize the detailed gamer playing history. They either match players randomly or use simple assignment rules, such as matching players with similar skill levels. Given the data-rich environment of online video games, video game companies have begun to realize that it may be possible to create better matching rules. However, there has been little systematic research investigating how behavioral player dynamics can be leveraged to improve matching assignment. So it's clear that engagement-optimized matchmaking, especially in FPS, is a very new thing. I've heard a lot of Call of Duty content creators and even developers on Twitter claim that engagement-optimized matchmaking has been in games for a long time, but they're simply not telling the truth. EOMM is quite new. It's the product of recent advances in consumer research. It's not going away either. In 2017, researchers largely from EA conducted a simulation based on real game data which aimed to test how effective EOMM and skill matching on SBMM are at reducing churn or player attrition. That is, the rate at which people leave the game and stop playing. It turns out that EOMM is better than SBMM, up to 15% better at reducing churn, but SBMM is not better than random at reducing churn. They even set up a simulation to falsify their conclusions called WorstMM, purposefully designed to increase churn to the maximum extent. Here are the results. The improvement of EOMM over SkillMM, the most common matchmaking method, in terms of the average number of retained players are 0.3%, 0.9%, 1.1%, and 0.6%. And on average, EOMM retains 0.7% more players compared with SkillMM after one round of matchmaking. Notably, the benefit of retention will accumulate over time in a consistent population. For players who play 20 rounds of matchmaking games within 8 hours, there will be 15% more players retained by EOMM over those by SkillMM. The more rounds of matchmaking are conducted, the more significant is the accumulative advantage of EOMM in engagement. We do not find a consistent climb in retention boost as P increased. This may suggest that when the player pool reaches a certain size, the choices of opponents are not enough to rescue those players on the edge of churn. Beyond this size, a larger player pool may not bring in significantly extra benefits and engagement maximization. As a validation, WorstMM consistently retains the fewest players in the pools of all sizes. This result verifies the optimum of EOMM from the opposite side. It is also interesting to note that SkillMM does not consistently outperform RandomMM, which is aligned with our discussion in the theoretical findings in Section 4, that is, balanced matches are not always optimal for engagement. A 15% increase in player retention is a huge benefit to publishers and shareholders that might translate to millions of dollars in revenue. Again, companies need a growth-oriented mindset to sustain themselves under the conditions of capitalism, so they're not going to turn EOMM down for the sake of the players. However, the models and simulations, maybe they don't actually translate as cleanly to reality as executives and researchers may have hoped. Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War performed far worse in the first 6 weeks of sales than Modern Warfare. Now, maybe this could just be the result of any number of things, but my money is on the game's EOMM alienating players and making casual group play with friends of disparate skill levels impossible. Cold War's beta was the most downloaded in Call of Duty history, yet its sales failed to match Modern Warfare's, so clearly, people took a peek and didn't like what they saw. Before the game even launched, content creators like Nero Cinema, 402 Thunder, Blame Truth, and many others were talking about how strong the EOMM was, and many players already felt deceived after EOMM and reverse boosting were exposed in Modern Warfare by the community. So it was a distinct possibility that the major reason people failed to buy Cold War was the game's matchmaking system. There's even some internal proof that this is the case, because Activision internal surveys show that the average Call of Duty player prefers to play with friends and is less likely to find Modern Warfare and/or Warzone fun, as reported by Tom Henderson of Viral Junkie, who regularly relays reliable internal information about Call of Duty to the community. So is EOMM backfiring? No. Modern Warfare 2 broke franchise records, raking in $800 million in sales. The idea that there will be organic backlash against EOMM has been proven completely false, since millions of people continue to buy these manipulative games, just as millions of people continue to dump all of their money into gambling addictions. I really want to underscore how big of a problem this EOMM creates for many people. Not everyone is equally skilled at games, and most people have friends with wide skill gaps. That's why, in contrast to Call of Duty's method of algorithmic matchmaking, most competitive FPS games like Counter-Strike or Rainbow Six Siege have two matchmaking modes, casual and ranked. Casual usually allows players of all skill levels to play together since it has wide skill tolerances, while ranked modes narrowly determine player skill, assign a rank, and match players based on that rank or some kind of elo system. The purpose of ranked modes in these games isn't to artificially drive engagement or to create protected brackets of unskilled players, but instead to satisfy competitive players who want to test themselves and gauge their own level of skill while working to improve at the game, earning new ranks as a fun reward. Not everyone enjoys ranked, so the casual modes need to exist as an alternative, and usually they either have very loose skill matching or none at all, allowing groups of friends with different skill levels to play together without the matches being too hard, and for people to avoid the stress of losing ranked games and competing as hard as possible to win. Ranked, on the other hand, will usually outright prevent widely disparate parties from even playing, since the experience will not be fun whatsoever. The low-skill players will repeatedly lose or just be a burden to the players who are solo queuing and expecting to play with equivalently skilled teammates. There's a little bit of something to please everyone in such a system that offers unranked matchmaking because it offers player choice. On the other hand, Call of Duty has decided to remove all player choice from the equation, adding EOMM, which according to various patents, calculates hidden matchmaking scores based on a number of different variables, including playstyle and actions per minute, as well as metrics of player skill like KD ratio, accuracy, movement heat maps, loadouts, or headshot percentage. There's no longer any casual mode devoid of skill matching, but instead good players are forced to play exclusively against good players until they're put in a rigged match, and average players against average until again they're put into a rigged match, making matches stressful and frustrating for people who don't want a competitive and unfair experience. Moreover, the system strives not only to equalize player skill, but also to create the aforementioned addictive win-loss patterns by deliberately placing players into unbalanced matches where they are destined to either win or lose. It ends up undercutting player agency because if you win or lose a match, it's no longer the result of your performance, but rather, it's simply a result that the game has predetermined. So rather than creating a more fair, fun gameplay experience, SBMM or EOMM in current Call of Duty titles is very much the opposite. It doesn't create fair lobbies, but instead unfair ones in which the player is often expected to carry a low skill team, or matches in which you get to play against the lowest skill team and stomp them. Most matches are roughly evenly matched until the game throws you a single easy lobby to keep you playing, and then a bunch more difficult and competitive lobbies. The system does this deliberately, and it is not random. Everything is precisely calculated to increase player engagement and to decrease churn. If you haven't played the game for a long time, as I've said, you'll get easier matches. If you buy a microtransaction bundle, then your matches will also become easier, at least that's how it seems. Many of these implementations can be found in patents filed by Activision in 2017 and in 2019, which are quite easy to find since it's publicly available information, which has been widely discussed by the COD community. Ultimately, all of this upsets the competitive fairness that makes multiplayer FPS so compelling. Manipulative EOMM makes players paranoid that their losses were not the result of their own failures, but simply a fatalistic determination by the game. Wins also become unsatisfying because it becomes glaringly obvious that the wins are predetermined, designed to artificially give you an injection of dopamine to prevent you from quitting. The game even records frequencies of quits to the menu and will start to learn exactly how many losses and hard lobbies you can tolerate before you rage quit the game, and it will then adjust accordingly. Astute players have even found a patent indicating a potential implementation of algorithms to modify hitboxes and health values in real time during a match, and many people feel like this is implemented into Call of Duty. In my anecdotal experiences, I've seen kill cams where players shoot me with a sniper rifle and miss by a foot and still get a hit marker and a one-hit kill. I've seen players hit someone, but it doesn't even register. Then there are clips of enemies inexplicably having high health, or circumstances in which players have higher damage against you. I've personally felt like something is wrong with hit registration in the games, and it almost feels like the game is causing me to miss sometimes. Other players have complained about what they call aim resist using controller aim assist, where the game sometimes prevents you from aiming at enemies, or sometimes even flings your aim across the screen when you hold the ADS button. It's hard to tell if this is caused by the aforementioned real-time adjustment pattern, or whether it's just a bug, but it's important to point out that this happens when there isn't even an enemy behind the target, so it's not like the game is just coincidentally magnetizing your aim to conflicting targets. It's hard to explain why this happens, and so far, we've gotten no reply from Activision regarding it. Moreover, why does aim assist flick your aim away from targets sometimes? Again, with the existence of EOMM patents, it's hard to not suspect that we're being manipulated by the game. If it's indeed true that this isn't a bug and instead an intentional part of the system designed to nerf good players, that sets a dangerous precedent for the future of FPS that will destroy all fair competition and make the game stressful and frustrating, alienating everyone. But I don't think it's only skilled players who are affected by this kind of manipulation. Modern Warfare ranked as the most stressful game to play in 2019, according to a survey conducted by Comfy Slacks. It's here that I really want to underscore my previous point. Gacha games, and so by extension most modern live service games, are not designed to be satisfying, and by virtue of that, they are addictive. Their entire business model is to maximize consumption, and so they must make players ravenously hungry for rewards to facilitate that. When you play Call of Duty Modern Warfare or Warzone, you're not being treated like a human, but instead like a lab rat, getting a paltry treat for pulling a lever at the right time. You're connected up to all kinds of wires, feeding telemetry to the developers, allowing them to adjust the reward system just right to manipulate you and keep you there as long as possible. In other words, you're being transformed from a person into a commodity. If that doesn't feel alienating, then you're probably not even human. Something's got to change about this, otherwise FPS is gone and other genres are coming next. We might be able to band together and to tell Activision that we want EOMM removed from Call of Duty, but it's not that simple. Here I'd otherwise put some kind of call to action, some kind of boycott or letter writing campaign, but despite loud voices airing out their discontent, nothing has even changed. So here's what you need to understand. If you're up against anti-consumer practices by AAA game publishers, you're up against corporate capitalism. There's nothing you can really do about it aside from attempting to disengage from it for your own sake. Stop buying AAA releases from publishers who treat their consumers like lab rats and their employees like slaves. Don't do it out of some kind of romanticist democratic ideal because you think you're voting for your wallet. Do it to save yourself time and money that could be spent on more enjoyable things. By allowing these corporations to manipulate you, you're allowing yourself to be injected with emotions, passions, ideals, false loyalties, and sometimes even a sense of artificial accomplishment. Instead of wasting your time on these manipulative games and the fundamental emptiness that they cause, maybe learn a skill or make your own videos. There are plenty of channels on YouTube that can teach you how to draw, write, compose, model, program, edit, and so on. Play single-player games that allow you to mod them to your liking, or buy more indie games from good developers who put art before profit. Do whatever you can to disconnect from the corporate live service market, because ultimately, FPS is dead, and you need to let it get buried before things get any better. The axioms that we all learned about classically liberal capitalism in public school were false. We were told that competition and the profit motive would cause companies to compete over making better products, and so it benefited the consumer. However, what has actually happened is that companies, instead of competing to make better products that incidentally benefit the consumer, are instead competing over better manipulating and exploiting consumers. Where the consumer is the commodity, which is glaringly obvious in our information age where data has a price tag, companies are merely competing to enslave, exploit, and control you. Moreover, to advance liberal democracy and its bedfellow capitalism, proponents of the system must assume that all people are rational actors because, for the system to not become exploitative and to be governed by free choice rather than top-down action, people must be making informed individual decisions. However, we know that people are not rational actors and that they rarely act alone as individuals. The first reason for this is that advertising and propaganda, which are the same thing, work. They modify people's thought and behavior such that they'll support a policy that is against their own interests, such as mass immigration, or buy a product that they would not otherwise buy, such as cigarettes or risky pharmaceuticals that have serious side effects. The second reason we know people are not rational actors is that capitalism relies on many forms of irrationality to drive profits. The most obvious example is brand loyalty, where consumers, convinced by network effects and advertising, will form social groups and tribes around a consumer identity. Coke people will only buy Coke, and Pepsi people will only buy Pepsi. AMD people will only buy AMD, while Nvidia people will only buy Nvidia. Xbox versus PlayStation, Ford versus Chevy, Android versus iOS, you get the idea. Such an attitude is completely irrational if competition does tend to produce better products for consumers. If that is true, then exclusively buying one brand's products does not make sense because another company would eventually make a better product, and so it would be rational to choose the competitor's superior product instead. Advertising in general relies on irrational herd psychology and subliminal manipulation to modify consumer behavior. The fact of the matter is that there is a well-funded science of mass manipulation of popular behavior called psychology, which has subfields like consumer research and marketing. Edward Bernays, who wrote books on herd psychology, is known as the father of advertising and is well studied by those who write on the subject of political propaganda. This isn't just some marginal thing, it's a legitimate institutional feature of modern liberal society. Capitalism is definitely a problem, but what's the solution? On YouTube, the prevalent response is socialism. However, I want to propose an alternative way to think about the problem. In our modern society, it's common to see that the only antithesis to capitalism is communist or democratic socialism, like it's some kind of binary that must necessarily be true. People might suppose that nationalizing or unionizing the game industry would solve the problem. I see tons of calls for developers' unions, but here's the thing. Nationalization would simply put the games industry under the control of a government, which by itself is already corrupted in the pocket of corporations. It would not solve the problem. On the other hand, unionization would also not solve the problem because unions are ultimately just labor protectionism. They create employee exclusivity, causing companies to start bidding over employees with the unions, usually resulting in increased wages and reducing the size of the labor pool. They might make the work environment and benefits more livable and enjoyable for game developers, but it doesn't make the corporations who hire them care less about profit. At the same time, it merely creates a privileged class of workers that crowd out the underclass of newcomers who cannot manage to join the unions, so it does not solve the hiring or exploitation issue either. I'm not alone in disliking unions, since there is even a wide amount of left anarchist discourse against unionization because they believe that it merely allows people to tolerate the exploitative conditions under which we all live. Similarly, nationalizing the gaming industry would simply change the source of funding over which companies are competing without making them any less greedy or deceptive. If you've ever seen scientists fight over grant money, you'll know what kind of dirty tricks I'm talking about. The core problem that needs to be solved is that of the modern prioritization of profit over principles. Instead of prioritizing growth, corporations need to start prioritizing quality. Instead of prioritizing competitions, corporations should prioritize cooperation. What I propose to accomplish this is to replace the modern corporate model with that of the model of the ancient corporation, such as that which functioned in ancient Rome, in which the company is owned absolutely by one person whose ownership is chartered by the state. Maybe we should also consider the artisan guilds of the Middle Ages, which share similarities. Under my proposal, one person fully owns the means of production and controls all aspects of the company, which is the foil of publicly traded companies that are owned jointly by shareholders who get to make all of the major decisions. Instead of the monetary aspirations of people who have no intrinsic stake in the company's art or vision, the artistic and philosophical realizations of one man alone can determine the course of the company and its productions, which is more conducive to the creation of quality art. The reason why id became such a successful company under John Carmack, and the reason why their games were so great, is precisely because John Carmack was at the helm and could accomplish his artistic vision without worrying about shareholders. The reason why modern games suck is because they are soulless corporate cash grabs designed by committee, so we need to get rid of the committee and create a condition where games are once again designed by gamers for gamers. We can bring the golden age of gaming back. Games companies should be owned by gamers again and not by Wall Street. Moreover, if companies only had a single owner and were no longer under the legal requirement to maximize profit, they would no longer be under the pressure to asymptotically grow and could instead maintain whatever size they wish, big or small, and publish whatever projects that they want, relatively free from the pressures of the market. A big reason why companies chase trends and make copycat clones of other successful games is due to competition over market share. So the obvious solution is to encourage cooperation rather than competition. Ultimately, in the European Middle Ages, guilds were essentially anti-competitive and carried with them a whole host of economic inefficiencies. The inefficiencies were great, though, and they were by design because the focus wasn't on profit, but instead on artistic virtue. The quality of craftsmanship would not be compromised simply to sell more units or to grow the company like a cancer. Employees and guilds benefit from the structure because the company's structure is more personal and less bureaucratic, making it more likely that the employees will be treated with dignity and paid well, rather than exploited in a manic rush to push games out to market during mandatory crunch. As Karl Marx said, under capitalism, there is an incentive simply to consume labor rather than to preserve it. This is why Blizzard, after releasing a record-breaking game, will immediately lay off thousands of developers. So under the guild system, there would simply be less competition and less market pressure, and the art aspect and the personal aspect can be emphasized, and a real philosophical upheaval can be made that returns game development to a product of passion and virtue like it was to some extent back in the 90s. We could apply the same proposal to all industries, and it would likely have similar effects. Now, I'm not under any illusion that such drastic changes could occur even within my lifetime, or could even be brought about by our actions. I don't even know if they would be popular considering the stranglehold of capitalism and Marxism in the modern world, which all of us are conditioned into. People today and for the foreseeable future will continue to hold a materialistic outlook on art and society, as centuries of development have led us to this point of venerating efficiency and scale, a point of which people are judged only by their wealth and productivity and not what's inside, and in which ventures are judged by how productive or profitable they are rather than how they benefit the human ends. So many people today offer the same banal critiques that the issue is the existence of wealthy barons who exploit the masses, and that the artistic betrayal carried out under capitalism can be solved by simply giving the company to the people. However, such critics fail to consider that those people hold ultimately the same mindset as the billionaire capitalists, materialism and the reign of quantity, and that capitalism has always counted upon the proletariat as its greatest ally when it goes about smashing higher values. Centuries of development of this idea of mass markets and mass production, accelerated by Marxism as well as the Industrial Revolution, cemented materialist attitudes and gave rise to faux revolts that also sought to smash all principles. The strict parameters under which artists in the Soviet Union were authorized to express themselves in the style of Soviet realism speaks to this fact that really, the final insult to artistic value, whether it's reached through materialist capitalism or materialist socialism, is quite the same, that the people and the artists who labor under these conditions both suffer for it. What is necessary is a revolution in values, not merely an exchange of who manages this reign of quantity. But ultimately, dreaming about the future and proposing ideas is not going to solve the problem. So really, what should we do? What should you do? The real praxis is this: stop buying AAA games and spend your money on things that make you a better person. The only variable you can directly control is you, and you have an inner life that needs to be fulfilled and nurtured. Don't waste your energy on frustrating games of Modern Warfare, unboxing skins in Counter-Strike, or grinding the Battle Pass in Fortnite. Do literally anything else. Engagement optimization poisons your brain and manipulates you, so get away from it as much as you possibly can. Drop out of the system. Buy games without engagement optimization, buy more single-player games, and don't punish yourself. You deserve better. We all deserve better.